The Pax Humanis Protocol, Chapter 1, The Lowest Bidder. The air in the high chamber of Council Prime did not circulate so much as it stagnated in a state of expensive, filtered perfection. Grand Arbiter Vex adjusted his silken robes, the bioluminescent patterns on his throat shifting from a calm cerulean to a frustrated, pulsing violet. Behind him, the glass spire rose miles into the atmosphere, a monument to 1,000,000 years of galactic stability that was currently being bled dry by the cost of its own existence. The holographic display in the center of the room flickered, projecting a grainy, low-fidelity image of a human female in a charcoal-colored tactical suit. Admiral Sarah Thorne did not look like a diplomat. She looked like a piece of industrial equipment that had been roughly handled and never cleaned. She sat in a room that smelled of ozone and stale coffee, a sharp contrast to the floral, synthetic sense of the Council's inner sanctum. Vex tapped a digit against the obsidian console, bringing up the physiological dossier of the species, known as the United Nations Colonial Administration. Admiral Thorne, Vex began, his voice a melodic series of clicks and whistles translated into a flat, artificial baritone. We have reviewed your bid for the Sector for Peacekeeping contract, and to be blunt, the Council is skeptical. Thorne didn't blink. She simply leaned forward, her sultan pepper hair catching the harsh light of a Martian shipyard. Your skepticism is expensive, Arbiter, she said, her voice like gravel being crushed under a heavy boot. Vex gestured to a secondary screen displaying a human soldier consuming a dark, compressed bar of organic matter. Our medical analysts inform us that this caffeine-infused nutrient bar contains levels of neurostimulants that would induce cardiac arrest in 90% of the species represented in this room. You come from a world with a gravity well that shouldn't allow for the evolution of complex life, yet you thrive in it. You are persistence hunters who evolved to run prey into a state of total metabolic collapse. And now, you are offering to police the most volatile sectors of the Orion Spur for less than half the cost of a standard pacifist fleet. Thorne allowed the ghost of a smile to touch her lips, an expression that Vex's translation matrix flagged as predatory. We're the lowest bidder because we aren't burdened by the overhead of a sovereign state military budget, Arbiter. The UNCA operates as a chartered corporate entity under our own internal statutes. We aren't sending you an army. We are sending you contracted compliance officers equipped for high-risk asset recovery. The Arbiter shifted his weight, his feathers ruffling in a gesture of deep-seated unease. The Council was weary of the astronomical costs associated with the great pacifist fleet, whose ships were built of gold and good intentions. They needed someone to do the dirty work, someone who didn't mind the grime of the border worlds or the political fallout of a heavy-handed intervention. And the payment? Vex asked, though he already knew the answer. We don't need your credits, Vex, Thorne said, reaching for a ruggedized stylus. Per the terms laid out in Section 8, Paragraph 4, we accept salvage rights as the primary form of compensation for all successful de-escalation maneuvers. Any debris, decommissioned hulls, or abandoned infrastructure resulting from an intervention becomes the sole property of the UNCA. The Council members whispered among themselves, their voices a rustle of wings and clicking of mandibles. To them, It sounded like a bargain. They were essentially paying the humans in trash and wreckage. Vex looked at the signature line on the holographic charter, a document that spanned 4,000 pages of dense, human-authored legalese. You realize that you will be bound by the Universal Peacekeeping Charter, Admiral Vex asked. One last attempt to assert dominance. You are prohibited from using offensive explosives, chemical agents, or any weaponry designed for the total annihilation of a civilian population. Thorne didn't even look at the ethics clauses as she pressed the stylus to the digital pad. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the expenditure and salvage section, her fingers moving with a practiced, chilling efficiency. We aren't here to start a war, Counselor, she said as the seal of the UNCA appeared on the document in a deep, blood-red ink. We're here to ensure the billing cycle for this sector isn't interrupted by your rebellion. A low, industrial stamp echoed through the chamber, a sound that felt more like a hammer hitting an anvil than a legal confirmation. Vex felt a sudden, inexplicable chill as the bioluminescence on his throat flickered and died. 6 hours later, the first human vessel arrived in the Oros system. It was not a sleek, white cruiser of the pacifist fleet, nor was it a gleaming diplomat's shuttle. It was a gavel-class heavy escort, a brutalist slab of gunmetal grey iron that looked more like a floating skyscraper than a ship. It was bristling with sensor clusters and unpowered railgun ports, its hull scarred by micrometeorites and previous negotiations. As it entered the system, it didn't broadcast a message of peace or a greeting of brotherhood. Instead, it sent a wideband transmission that reached every ship, every station, and every orbital habitat in the sector. This is UNCA compliance vessel Auditor General a voice announced, flat and devoid of emotion. The Pax Humanis protocol has been initiated in this sector. Please be advised that all non-standard orbital maneuvers are now considered a billable safety violation. We look forward to a peaceful and profitable partnership. In the high chamber, Vex watched the sensor feed of the human ship with growing dread. He had thought he was hiring cheap labor to sweep the porch of the galaxy. He realized now, looking at the grim, silent efficiency of the Auditor General that he hadn't hired a janitor. He had opened the door for a species that considered nuclear deterrent a diplomatic greeting and peace a line item on an invoice. Thorne's final words from the session echoed in his mind, a detail he had overlooked in the rush to save the budget. Oh, and Arbiter? She had said just before the transmission cut. The Salvage Clause is retroactive to any debris created during our intervention, including any unforeseen collateral damage caused by non-compliant parties. Vex looked at the legal text again, his eyes widening as he found the specific subclause. The humans hadn't just come to stop the fighting. They had come to collect the galaxy, one piece of wreckage at a time. Chapter 2, The Liability Loophole. Commander Vor of the Kalath insurgency didn't believe in ghosts, but the ship on his view screen was haunting him. His fleet had been hammering the massive, blocky human vessel for 20 minutes. Plasma bolts splashed against its grey hull like rain against a window. Kinetic slugs pancaked against its reinforced plating, leaving nothing but silver smears and wasted energy. The human ship, the Auditor General, hadn't moved. It hadn't raised its shields. It hadn't even powered up its point defense turrets. Status report. Vor screamed, his mandibles clicking in a frantic, uneven rhythm. Their hull is holding at 98% structural integrity, Commander. His tactical officer replied, his voice trembling. We have depleted for thermal cells and half our remaining missile rack, and they still haven't returned fire. Vor asked, his vision blurring with rage. Nothing but a low-level sensor sweep. Sir, the officer said, they're just watching us. Vor slammed a fist into his command chair. To the Kalath, war was a glorious exchange of heat and light. This was silent. This was insulting. On the bridge of the Auditor General, Sergeant Macready leaned back in a chair that creaked under his combat armor. He wasn't looking at a tactical map or a targeting reticle. He was looking at a digital stopwatch and a spreadsheet titled Hazardous Waste Mitigation. They're slowing down, Mac. A voice crackled over the internal comms. It was the ship's logistics officer, a man who sounded more like an accountant than a sailor. Primary plasma batteries on the lead. Rebel ship are showing signs of thermal fatigue. Macready took a slow sip of lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. Good, Mac said, his voice a low, rhythmic growl. Let them cook their own barrels. Are we clear on the protocol? The ablative insurance buffers are holding, Sergeant, the voice replied. Per UNCA statute for 102, since we haven't initiated an offensive act. This entire engagement is classified as an unsolicited stress test of our safety equipment. A massive explosion rocked the ship. As a rebel missile found a sensor cluster, the Auditor General groaned. But the vibration felt more like a yawn than a death rattle. Mac didn't even spill his coffee. That's a billable sensor suite, Mac noted, tapping a key on his console. Mark it under property damage. Intentional. Calculate the kinetic energy of every slug they've fired. We're going to need a total mass count for the cleanup phase. Back on the Kalath flagship, Vor was reaching the breaking point. Charge the main breaker, he commanded. If they won't fight, we will melt them where they sit. The rebel ship began to glow as its reactor pushed past the red line. Energy spiraled into the main spinal cannon, a weapon designed to crack orbital stations. In the Auditor General's cockpit, a warning light flickered. They're charging the big one, Mac, the pilot said, a hint of excitement breaking through his professional mask. Orders. Macready stood up, stretching his back until his spine popped. Open a wideband channel, Mac said, and send the pre-formatted notice of liability to their bridge. Commander Vor's screen flickered, replacing the image of the human ship with a wall of dense, scrolling text. It was a legal document. Attention Kalath insurgency forces. Mac's voice filled the rebel bridge, sounding impossibly bored. This is UNCA Compliance Officer Macready. You are currently discharging unregulated hazardous materials into a protected trade lane. Specifically, you have released 600 tons of spent plasma gas and 3,000 kinetic projectiles. Vor stared at the screen, his brain struggling to process the words. Is this a joke? Vor hissed. We are killing you. You are creating a navigational hazard. Mac corrected him. Under the Oro System Safety Compact, the UNCA is now authorized to perform emergency waste reclamation by firing your main cannon. You are officially requesting our hazardous materials disposal service. The current rate for combat debris removal is 50,000 credits per kilojoule. Please cease fire if you do not wish to be billed for further disposal. Vor felt a cold, sinking sensation in his gut that had nothing to do with the reactor's heat. He looked at the energy levels of his own ship. They were nearly dry. They had spent their entire treasury's worth of ammunition on a ship that was currently treating them like a sanitation problem. Fire, Vor whispered. But it was a plea, not a command. The spinal cannon roared, a beam of blinding white light slamming into the Auditor General's bow. The human ship disappeared in a cloud of superheated steam and ionizing radiation. For a moment, Vor felt a surge of triumph. Then, the light faded. The Auditor General was still there. A large section of its frontal armor had been turned into a glowing, molten sludge. But the ship remained steady. The molten metal didn't float away. Instead, magnetic harpoons shot out from the human ship's sides, catching the debris and pulling it into specialized containment bays. Service initiated, Mac's voice returned, now accompanied by a ticking counter at the bottom of Vor's screen. The numbers were climbing so fast they were a blur. We are now reclaiming your spent energy and warped plating. A final invoice will be forwarded to your planetary capital upon completion of the audit. Thank you for choosing UNCA for your planetary defense needs. Vor slumped into his chair as his reactor finally flickered and died, leaving his ship drifting in the dark. He had come to start a revolution. He realized now, watching the humans calmly vacuum up the remnants of his pride, that he had just become a customer. And in the UNCAS galaxy, the customer was always wrong. Chapter 3. The Kinetic Tax. The siege of Krios didn't break with a roar. It began with a whisper and a 30-page invoice. For 6 months, the Zidari Dominion had held the planet in a vice grip, their golden warships forming a perfect, glittering shell around the atmosphere. No food entered, no medicine left. The Zidari didn't need to fire a single shot to kill a world. They simply waited for the calories to run out. High Admiral Volos watched the sensor feed from his flagship, his 4 eyes blinking in synchronized satisfaction as a lone, ugly shape appeared on the long-range scanners. It wasn't a cruiser or a strike craft. It was a freighter, a massive, rusted brick of a ship that looked like it had been welded together in a scrap yard and propelled by spite. The hull bore the faded red letters of the UNCA and a name that made Valos's translator stutter. The overhead costs. Halt and prepare to be boarded, Volos commanded. His voice broadcast on a frequency that shook the human's rickety bridge. You are entering a restricted military exclusion zone. By order of the Dominion, all transit is suspended indefinitely. There was a long silence, filled only by the static of the void and the distant hum of the Zidari's superior engines. Then a voice replied. It wasn't a soldier's bark. It was the soft, weary tone of someone who had spent too much time looking at spreadsheets. This is Logistics Officer Holloway of the UNCA Supply Chain Division, the voice said. We aren't here for transit, Admiral. We're here to perform a safety inspection of your orbital positioning. Volos let out a sound like grinding stones. His version of a laugh. You are a merchant ship in a war zone, Volos spat. Leave now. or we will reduce your safety inspection to a cloud of radioactive dust." Holloway didn't sound intimidated. He sounded like he was checking a watch. "Admiral, per the Pax Humanis protocol, your ships are currently occupying high-traffic commercial vectors without a valid permit. By sitting still in a blockade formation, you are technically loitering in a navigational throughway. Under Section 12, subsection B, the UNCA is authorized to clear all obstructions that impede the flow of contracted relief supplies. We are initiating kinetic displacement of your fleet." Volos narrowed his eyes. "You have no weapons," he mocked. "Your ship is a cargo hauler, correct?" Holloway replied, his voice dipping into that terrifyingly helpful customer service tone. "We don't have weapons. We have mass. The overhead costs didn't fire a laser or launch a missile. Instead, its massive engines roared to life, not pushing the ship forward, but spinning it. The freighter began to vent thousands of tons of compressed iron ore from its side bays, not as a projectile, but as a stationary cargo cache. The ore didn't move toward the Zidari. It simply sat in space, cold and silent. Then, the human ship accelerated, its massive bulk pulling a series of guidance tethers that were anchored to the floating ore. "What are you doing?" Volos demanded as the sensor alarms on his flagship began to scream. "We're delivering our non-compliant parking fee," Holloway said. "Since your ships refuse to move, we are simply utilizing the gravity of your own hulls to assist in our cargo stabilization." The math was brutal. The human ship wasn't attacking. It was performing a high-speed gravity slingshot, using the mass of the Zidari fleet to swing its cargo caches into a new trajectory. But the caches, millions of tons of raw iron, were now moving at 4% the speed of light. They weren't aiming for the Zidari ships. They were aiming for the space exactly 3 meters behind their engines. As the iron slammed through the blockade's formation, the vacuum displacement and gravitational shear tore through the Zidari's delicate golden hulls. Ships were spun like tops, their internal gyros shattering under the sudden, massive torque. The blockade didn't explode, it unraveled. The perfect shell of ships was now a chaotic mess of tumbling metal and frantic course corrections. "You've struck us," Volos screamed as his flagship groaned under the gravitational wake. "That was a kinetic strike." "Negative, Admiral," Holloway replied, the sound of a keyboard clicking in the background. "That was an unintentional vector collision caused by your failure to yield the right-of-way. Per the Charter, the UNCA is not liable for damages resulting from improperly parked military assets. In fact, your ships have scratched the paint on our cargo containers. The kinetic tax for this interaction has been calculated at 4 billion credits. Would you like to pay by planetary bond, or should we continue our delivery?" Volos looked at his fleet. 3 of his best destroyers were currently drifting toward the planet's atmosphere, their engines dead and their crews in a panic. The human freighter was already preparing another delivery. The overhead costs turned its blunt nose toward the flagship, its engines glowing with the heat of a small sun. "We surrender," Volos barked, his pride dissolving into pure, bureaucratic terror. "We will move. Just stop the deliveries." "Excellent," Holloway said, his voice returning to its dull, professional hum. "We've marked your exit vector. Please ensure you leave a 5-star review for our rapid displacement service. It helps with our quarterly bonuses, as the Zigdari fleet fled the system in a frantic, disorganized scramble. The ugly human freighter drifted toward the starving planet. It didn't look like a savior. It didn't look like a hero. It looked like a bill that had finally come due. And as the first crates of food began to drop toward the surface, Holloway took a slow, methodical sip of his coffee, marked the system as cleared. He told the pilot, and make sure to bill the planet for the delivery fee. Peace is expensive, after all. Chapter 4. The Safety Tax. The mining colony on Krios didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like a paycheck waiting to happen. The moon was a jagged tooth of silicate and rare earth minerals, crawling with Zidari miners who spent their lives in the dark, pulling wealth from the crust. The Zidari foreman, a creature with 6 spindly limbs and a perpetual coat of rock dust, watched as a human shuttle descended. It wasn't a military dropship. It was painted a bright, offensive safety orange. The side of the vessel bore the logo of the UNCA Bureau of Structural Integrity. Sergeant Mac Macready stepped out of the airlock, not carrying a rifle, but a holographic tablet and a heavy-duty laser level. He wasn't wearing combat armor. He was wearing a high-visibility tactical vest over a vacuum suit. Foreman Grell, Max said, his voice echoing in the thin, recycled air of the dome. I'm Sergeant Macready, Senior Safety Compliance Officer. We're here for the mandatory structural audit. Grell's mandibles clicked in a sequence of annoyed chirps. We didn't request an audit, the foreman said, his translator struggling with the human's lack of inflection. Our tunnels have stood for 3 centuries. The Dominion has already certified this site. Macready didn't look up from his tablet. The Dominion isn't the primary insurer for this sector anymore. Grell, per the Pax Humanis protocol, the UNCA has identified a critical stability deficit in your primary support struts. By law, we cannot allow your personnel to work in an imminently catastrophic environment. Effective immediately, we are installing mandatory stability anchors to prevent a crustal collapse. Before the foreman could protest, 3 more human shuttles slammed into the landing pads. They didn't carry soldiers, they carried massive, industrial-grade tectonic stabilizers, 6-story towers of humming steel and copper coils. Human engineers moved with the terrifying speed of pursuit predators, anchoring the towers directly into the moon's bedrock. What is this? Grell demanded, pointing at the glowing blue lights atop the towers. These are Mark 7 inertial dampeners, Mac explained, sounding bored. They create a mass proximity shear field that counteracts tectonic shifts. They're the gold standard in human safety tech. But they require power, Grell noted, his internal sensors beginning to spike. A lot of power. Correct, Max said, finally looking the alien in the eyes. Safety isn't free, Foreman. Within an hour, the moon's primary reactor began to groan. The stability anchors weren't just running. They were gorging themselves. The colony's lights flickered, then dimmed to a dull, emergency red. Life support fans slowed to a sluggish crawl. The massive mining drills, the heart of the colony's profit, shuddered and died as their power was rerouted to the safety equipment. You are killing our production, Grell screamed. his limbs twitching in distress. "The anchors are drawing 90% of our total output. We can't breathe, we can't dig, and we can't pay the Dominion." Macready tapped a button on his tablet, bringing up a new spreadsheet. "That is a critical energy shortfall, Foreman. Running a colony on 10% power is a violation of the UNCA life preservation standards. If you can't provide adequate power for your workers, we'll have to shut the whole operation down and evacuate the site. Unless, of course, you'd like to purchase a temporary energy supplement." Grell froze. He looked through the dome's reinforced glass at the horizon. A massive UNCA mobile siphon ship was already descending, its fusion coils glowing with the heat of a captured star. It wasn't here to protect them. It was here to sell them back the very air they were losing. "How much?" Grell whispered, his translator crackling. "The current rate for emergency fusion tap is double the market value," Max said, his voice flat and professional, "plus a 20% intervention surcharge for the fast-tracked delivery. But don't worry, Foreman. We accept raw ore as payment at a 15% discount on the spot price." The foreman looked at his dead drills, then at the glowing human ships, and finally at the safety towers that were currently strangling his moon. He realized then that the humans hadn't brought weapons. They had brought an ecosystem of debt. "Sign here," Max said, extending the digital stylus. "It's better than the alternative." "And what is the alternative?" Grell asked. Macready looked at the dark, cold tunnels behind the foreman. "The alternative is a total site for closure due to unsafe working conditions. And trust me, the cleanup fees for that are a nightmare," Grell signed, as the power from the human ship began to flood the grid. The lights came back on, but they felt colder than before. Macready took a slow sip from a thermos, the scent of bitter coffee filling the air. "Good choice, Foreman," Max said. "Safety first." He turned and walked back toward his orange shuttle, leaving the Zidari to mine their own moon just to pay for the right to stand on it. In the distance, the stability anchors hummed, a sound that wasn't protecting the crust. It was the sound of a species that had turned health and safety into the ultimate conquest. Chapter 5. The Salvage Clause. The battle for the Aura's Gate was a masterpiece of pointless destruction. The Sil Republic and the Crag Hegemony had spent 3 days, turning 1 billion credits worth of starships into glowing clouds of slag and frozen atmosphere. The void was choked with the viscera of war. Twisted girders, ruptured fuel cells, and the silent, drifting bodies of those who hadn't reached the life pods. High Commander Kroll of the Sil watched his tactical display, his 3 hearts pounding in a frantic, uneven rhythm. His flagship, the Starlight, was venting plasma from 12 hull breaches. His fleet was broken. The Crag were closing in for the final, lethal blow. Then, the long-range scanners screamed. A massive, boxy silhouette tore through the veil of the nebula, accompanied by the thunderous boom of a distorted warp signature. It wasn't a reinforcement fleet. It was a single human vessel, the UNCA Recovery Unit *bottom line*. The ship was an industrial nightmare, a massive central spine draped in thousands of magnetic grappling arms and oversized tractor beam emitters. It didn't look like a warrior. It looked like a giant, multi-limbed insect coming to claim a carcass A wideband transmission slammed into every bridge in the system. Attention Sill and Crag combatants. The voice was female, sounding like a bored court stenographer. This is UNCA Salvage Director Reese Thorne. Per the Pax Humanis Protocol, Section 8. This area has been declared a public safety hazard due to excessive unmanaged debris. Commander. Kroll barked a laugh that tasted like copper and smoke. We are in the middle of a war, human. Kroll screamed into his comms. Get your garbage scow out of the line of fire. Director Thorne didn't flinch. Negative. Commander. Under the Universal Salvage Statutes, any vessel showing more than 60% structural degradation is legally classified as abandoned material. We have scanned your fleet. Kroll. 80% of your ships meet the criteria. We are initiating preemptive asset recovery to prevent further environmental contamination. Before Kroll could respond, the bottom line didn't fire its weapons. It fired its tractor beams. Dozens of amber-colored beams lashed out, locking onto the drifting husks of Sill destroyers. The beams didn't just hold the ships. They began to reel them in with a terrifying mechanical force. One of the Sill cruisers, still firing its rear batteries, was jerked backward so hard its internal dampeners shattered. You're taking our ships, the Crag warlord bellowed, his voice joining the channel in a confused rage. Those are our prizes. We defeated them. Correction, warlord, Thorne replied. You created a navigational obstacle by failing to secure your prizes. Within the mandatory 10-minute window, you have forfeited all claims to the scrap value. We are now performing a mandatory cleanup service, and since you are still discharging ordnance into our salvage zone, we are adding a hazardous environment premium to your current bill. The bottom line moved with a predatory grace, its magnetic harpoons punching through the armor of a Crag frigate like needles through silk. It wasn't attacking, it was securing the inventory. The humans weren't killing the crews, they were simply dragging the ships into the massive internal maw of the recovery unit. Inside that maw, the sound of giant industrial shredders began to echo through the hulls of the ships being claimed. Kroll watched in horror as his secondary flagship, a vessel that had served his family for generations, was fed into the human grinders. Stop this, Kroll pleaded, his pride finally snapping. We will cease fire. We will retreat. Retreat is a billable maneuver, Thorne noted. If you leave the system now, you are illegally dumping the remaining 40% of your fleet. The fines for deep space abandonment exceed the total value of your home world's GDP. However, if you surrender your remaining vessels to our consignment program, we can offer you a tax-deductible credit toward your next war. The Crag warlord didn't wait to hear more. He ordered his remaining ships to jump to warp. But as the Crag engines spun up, the bottom line released a cloud of interference microchaff. It wasn't a weapon. It was protective padding intended to prevent salvage damage. The chaff clogged the Crag's warp shrouds, stalling their engines. You can't leave yet, Thorne said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly soft whisper. We haven't finished the inventory, and per the contract the Council signed, the UNCA has exclusive recovery rights to all tactical data generated during this interaction. That means we own your black boxes, and we own the rights to the story of how you lost. Crawl looked at his dying fleet, then at the massive human ship that was literally eating the history of his people. He realized then that the humans didn't care who won the war. They only cared who left the most wreckage. How much? Crawl whispered, the words a death rattle in his throat. To keep my flagship. How much do I owe you? Thorne paused, the sound of a digital calculator chirping in the background. For the Starlight? With the current market price of Durasteel and the emergency intervention fees, you owe us 3 moons, a permanent trade concession, and your third-born's weight in rare earth minerals. Or you can just step into the life pod and let the shredders do their job. Crawl looked at the giant, grinding teeth of the human ship. I'll sign, he said. As the human ship finished vacuuming the Auro's gate, the void was finally clean. No ships remained. No debris drifted. Only the asterisk bottom line asterisk sat in the silence, its cargo bays bulging with the recycled dreams of 2 empires. Thorne took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. Mark the system as remediated, she told the bridge crew, and send a thank you note to the council. Tell them we appreciate the business. War is a terrible waste of resources. Luckily, humans are very good at recycling. Chapter 6. The Insurance Policy. The sky over Elara Prime didn't turn red from the sunset. It turned red from the burning of the capital's atmospheric shields. Below the fire, High Priest Kale stood in the ruins of his temple, his forearms trembling as he clutched a communications relay. His people were peaceful, artistic, and entirely unprepared for the Geth warlords currently descending from the stars. Please, Kale whispered into the relay, his voice cracking against the roar of distant explosions. The council said you provide protection. We are a non-combatant world. We have no weapons, no shields, only our lives. A calm, rhythmic pulsing filled the relay, the sound of a human heartbeat synthesized into a digital carrier wave. This is UNCA Life Preservation Unit Sanctuary *. A voice replied. It wasn't Admiral Thorne or Sergeant Mac. This voice was soft, melodic, and possessed the terrifyingly artificial warmth of a hospice nurse. We have received your distress signal, Priest Kale. Per the Pax Humanis protocol, we are authorized to offer biological asset protection to all Tier 1 non-combatant species. Kale looked up as a massive, white and orange ship broke the clouds. It didn't look like the asterisk bottom line asterisk or the asterisk Auditor General asterisk. It was sleek, rounded, and bore a giant, glowing blue cross on its belly. It looked like mercy. Thank the creators, Kale sobbed, his knees hitting the ash-covered floor. Save us, stop the Geth. I'm sorry, Priest, the voice said, the synthetic warmth never wavering. Our contract specifically prohibits direct combat intervention against sovereign aggressors. We aren't here to fight your war. We are here to provide life preservation insurance. Kale blinked, a drop of purple blood running down his forehead. Insurance? But they are killing us now. Correct, the nurse replied. Which is why the premium for immediate extraction is currently at its peak. If you sign the Total Life Transfer Agreement now, we will initiate a safety evacuation of your entire civilian population. We will move your people to a UNCA-designated safe zone. The first gift dropship slammed into the temple courtyard, its ramp dropping to reveal a line of snarling, armored shock troops. Kale didn't look at the contract. He couldn't. He just pressed his palm to the glowing digital pad, held by a hovering human drone. "Save them," he screamed. "Initiating policy," the nurse said. The *sanctuary* didn't fire a single shot at the Geth. Instead, it released thousands of extraction pods, small, high-speed cylinders that slammed into every city center on the planet. The Geth warriors stopped, confused, as the pods opened not with guns, but with soft, inviting lights and the scent of synthetic lavender. "Attention Elara citizens," a voice broadcasted from every pod. "Please enter the preservation unit for immediate transport to your new safe zone. Your survival is our highest priority." The Elara, terrified and broken, flooded into the pods. On the temple steps, the Geth warlord raised his blade to strike Kale down. A human drone hovered between them, its blue cross glowing with a sudden, blinding intensity. "Cease all hostile action against this insured asset," the drone commanded. The Geth laughed, his blade swinging down. The drone didn't move. It simply projected a high-frequency safety perimeter that turned the Geth's blade into molten slag the moment it touched the field. "You are interfering with a conquest," the warlord roared. "Negative," the drone replied. "You are attempting to damage unpaid UNCA inventory. These individuals have signed over their productive rights in exchange for survival. They are no longer your victims. They are our capital assets." Kale watched as he was lifted into a pod, his body feeling weightless and numb. He looked out the small window as the *sanctuary* ascended, leaving his burning world behind. "Where are we going?" Kale asked, his voice a hollow echo. "Is it a world of peace? Is it a world of economic contribution?" "Priest," the nurse said, "you are being transported to the UNCA industrial belt. Since your world was lost, you no longer have a sovereign currency to pay your insurance premiums. Therefore, your people will be placed in our work-to-own citizenship program. You will be safe, you will be fed, and you will spend the next 300 years manufacturing stability anchors for the rest of the galaxy." Kale looked at his hands, the hands of a poet and a priest. He realized now that the humans hadn't saved them from the fire. They had simply moved the fire into a furnace and told the Elara to keep it burning. As the *sanctuary* jumped to warp, leaving the Geth warlord standing on a barren, empty rock, the nurse took a slow, methodical breath. "Logistics. This is Sanctuary. Asset recovery is complete. 5 million Tier 1 workers successfully repossessed. Mark the Elara system as foreclosed, and send the Geth a bill for the blade damage to our drone. Peace is a business, and the inventory is finally secure." Chapter 7. The Infrastructure LIEN. The liberation of the Xylos system didn't end with a parade. It ended with a clipboard and a lockout tag. For a decade, the Iron Overlord had ruled Xylos with a fist made of neutron star matter and a heart that didn't beat so much as it calculated casualties. His throne room was a cathedral of obsidian, decorated with the banners of 100 crushed resistance movements. But as the UNCA heavy shuttles landed in the smoking ruins of the palace, the banners were being replaced by yellow caution tape, a human recovery specialist named Elias. Thorne, distant cousin to the Admiral, and twice as Cole stepped over the Overlord's shattered crown. He wasn't carrying a sword. He was carrying a stack of thermal-printed eviction notices. Beside him, the leader of the Xylos resistance, a feathered avian named Kellen, watched with tears in his eyes. "It's over," Kellen whispered, his voice trembling with a decade of suppressed hope. "The tyrant is dead. We are finally free." Elias Thorne didn't look up from his data slate. "Correct, Kellen," Elias said, his voice flat and dusty. "The Overlord's regime has been successfully terminated for breach of contract. Under the Pax Humanis protocol, the UNCA has fulfilled its obligation to remove the systemic obstruction to local commerce. Now, we begin the asset reintegration phase." Kellen frowned, his feathers ruffling in the dry, ash-choked wind. "Asset reintegration? We just want to rebuild our homes. We want to start over." Elias finally looked at the alien, his eyes as gray as the Martian sky. "Rebuilding requires material capital, Kellen. During the liberation, the UNCA deployed 14 kinetic neutralizers, 3 orbital strike packages, and a full logistics scale of support. The total bill for your freedom has been calculated at 6 trillion credits. Since your planet's treasury was liquidated by the Overlord, you are currently in default." Kellen's breath caught in his throat. "We have no money. The tyrant took everything." "Exactly," Elias replied, tapping a button on his slate. "Which is why the UNCA has placed a senior infrastructure lien on all primary system assets. Effective immediately, the UNCA now owns the Xylos Stargate, the orbital shipyards, and your primary star's solar harvest rights." Kellen looked up at the sky, where the massive, shimmering Stargate, the only way in or out of the system, was currently being swarmed by human maintenance drones. The drones weren't repairing it. They were installing a massive physical deadbolt across the rings and painting the UNCA logo over the ancient Xylos symbols. "You're locking the gate?" Kellen gasped. "That's our only link to the galaxy. It's a safety foreclosure." "Kellen," Elias explained, sounding like he was explaining a bank statement to a child, "the Stargate is a high-value asset. We can't have non-authorized personnel using it while the debt is outstanding. If you want the gate opened, you'll need to pay the access restoration fee." "But how?" Kellen pleaded. "We have nothing but the dust under our feet." Elias Thorne allowed himself a small, chillingly professional smile. "Not true. Kellen, you have your labor. You have the remaining mineral rights in your crust, and you have the right to sign the UNCA Reconstruction Pact. We will provide you with food, medicine, and the tools to rebuild your cities. In exchange, the UNCA will manage your planet's exports for the next 99 years. You aren't slaves, of course. You are contracted partners in a long-term recovery project." Outside the throne room, the sound of heavy machinery filled the air. A massive UNCA harvester ship was descending toward the system's sun, its thermal shields glowing as it began to siphon off the star's energy. It wasn't stealing the light. It was escrowing the solar output to ensure the interest on the debt was paid. The sky over Xylos, once bright and vibrant, began to dim as the humans literally turned down the sun. "You're taking our light," Kellen whispered, the horror finally sinking in. "We're mitigating the risk," Kellen, Elias said, turning to walk back toward his shuttle. "Peace is expensive. Liberty is even more so. If you want the lights turned back up, I suggest your people start meeting their daily production quotas. Check the slate for your assignments. Welcome back to the galactic economy, Kellen. It's a pleasure doing business with you." As the shuttle lifted off, Kellen stood in the ruins of his freedom, looking up at a sun that was slowly being shuttered by a species that didn't need to win a war to own a world. They just needed to hold the bill. In the distance, the Stargate's lock groaned as it slid into place, a sound that echoed across the system like the slamming of a prison door. The humans had liberated Xylos. They had freed the people from a tyrant, and then they had charged them for the key to the cage. Chapter 8. The Sovereign Loophole. The Great Hall of Jurisprudence was a cathedral of absolute law. It was built from the petrified bones of ancient lawmakers, and lit by the cold, impartial glow of 100 judicial AEs. Grand Arbiter Vex sat on the high bench, his bioluminescent throat pulsing with a desperate, frantic gold. Across from him, the Council's chief prosecutor, a spider-like creature with 8 eyes that wept ink, shuffled a stack of formal grievances. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, and the heavy weight of 1,000,000 years of precedent. "The charges are clear," the prosecutor began, his voice a series of wet, clicking vibrations. "The United Nations Colonial Administration has violated the core tenets of the Galactic Accord. They have practiced predatory lending. They have seized sovereign assets under the guise of salvage. And they have physically locked a Stargate while dimming a primary star by 20%. Vex looked down at the human, sitting at the small, plain metal table in the center of the hall. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a man named Miller, dressed in a suit that cost more than a small moon, but looked intentionally boring. Miller wasn't looking at the judges. He was looking at a digital clock on his wrist. "Arbiter Vex," Miller said, his voice as smooth and frictionless as a cooling vent. "Before we begin the testimony, I'd like to move for an immediate dismissal based on lack of jurisdiction," the prosecutor hissed, his ink tears staining the ivory floor. "Jurisdiction? You are a signatory species of the Peacekeeping Charter. You are bound by the laws of this council." Miller stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look like a man in a courtroom. He looked like a man about to explain a billing error. "Correct," Miller said. "The UNCA is a signatory of the Charter, but you are attempting to sue us as a sovereign state. I would like to remind the court that the UNCA is not a government. We do not have a capital world. We do not have a citizenry in the legal sense. We are a chartered corporate entity operating under the UNCA commercial bylaws." Vex felt a cold, familiar dread settle in his chest. "The Charter applies to all peacekeeping forces." "Miller," Vex interjected, "regardless of your internal structure." "True," Miller replied, tapping a key on his tablet. "But the Galactic Accord defines war crimes and sovereign overreach as acts committed by one state against another. Under Section 9 of your own accord, a private corporation cannot commit a war crime. It can only commit a service breach or a contractual violation, and per our contract, all service disputes must be settled in UNCA-approved arbitration." The hall fell into a stunned, heavy silence. The judges looked at each other, their mechanical eyes worrying as they processed the logic. The humans hadn't joined the galaxy as a brother species. They had joined as a vendor. "You are dimming a sun," the prosecutor shrieked, his limbs flailing. "That is a crime against life itself." "That is a solar yield adjustment," Miller corrected. "It is a standard safety procedure to prevent the oversaturation of the local grid. During a liquidity crisis, since the Xylos system defaulted on their liberation fees, we are simply reducing our overhead. If the Council wishes to restore the light, you are welcome to buy out the Xylos debt at its current market value. Plus, of course, the litigation surcharge for this hearing." Vex gripped the edge of his bench until the ivory groaned. "You are saying we cannot fire you? You can terminate the contract at any time, Arbiter," Miller said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "But please refer to the early termination clause on page 3000. The fee for ending the Pax Humanis protocol prematurely is equivalent to 80% of the Council's total liquid assets. And since we currently hold the infrastructure liens on 60% of your transit hubs, the logistics of paying that fee would be complicated. In fact, the moment you dissolve our contract, we are legally required to repossess all peacekeeping hardware currently in the field. That includes the defensive arrays around Council Prime." The prosecutor collapsed into his chair, his ink tears now a dark, spreading pool. He realized now that they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting an accounting system that had been weaponized by a species that viewed justice as a negotiable line item. "So," Miller said, picking up his briefcase, "are we done here? Or would the Council like to discuss our new gold-tier judicial oversight package? It includes a 50% discount on all future malpractice fines." Vex looked at the human, then at the silent judges, and finally at the empty, sterile hall. He realized that the Council had spent 1,000,000 years building a perfect system of law, and the humans had simply treated it like a terms and conditions page. They didn't need to read. "The motion is granted," Vex whispered, his voice failing him. "Case dismissed for lack of jurisdiction." Miller nodded politely, as if he were leaving a coffee shop. "Wise choice, Arbiter. We'll send the invoice for today's legal consultation to your office by morning. And don't worry about the sun in Xylos. We've decided to turn it up by 5% as a gesture of goodwill. Peace is a partnership, after all." As the human walked out of the hall, the sound of his shoes on the petrified bone was the only noise in the galaxy. It was the sound of a species that didn't need to fire a single shot to conquer the stars. They just needed to make sure they were the ones holding the pen. And as the doors hissed shut, Vex realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that the humans weren't the lowest bidder. They were the new owners. Chapter 9. The Safety Audit. The final verdict didn't look like a ship. It looked like a floating fortress of Zidari arrogance. 3 miles of reinforced armor, 2,000 heavy iron batteries, and enough firepower to turn a moon into a memory. Commander Val watched from the bridge as a tiny, safety orange shuttle docked with their primary airlock. The shuttle bore the UNCA logo and a name that felt like a slap in the face: the Surveyor's Fee. "State your purpose," Val commanded, his voices echoing through the ship's internal comms. "This is a sovereign military vessel on active duty. You have no authority to board." A familiar, gravelly growl crackled over the speakers. "This is Sergeant Macready, UNCA Compliance Division," Mac said. "We aren't here as a military force, Commander. We are here per the Galactic Insurance Interoperability Act. Your ship is currently covered under the UNCAS Regional Protection umbrella. That means we are legally required to perform a spot stability audit every 6 months. Open the hatch, or we mark your entire fleet as uninsured." Val hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe. He knew the law. If the insurance was revoked, the Council would pull the Dreadnought's operating budget in an hour. "Open the hatch," Val ordered, "but keep them in the hangar. I want them off my ship in 10 minutes. Macready stepped onto the Zidari deck with a heavy clank of his work boots. He didn't have a rifle. He had a thermal imaging camera, a handheld gas sniffer, and a clipboard that looked like it had seen 100 battlefields. Behind him, 3 human safety technicians moved with a silent, professional speed. They weren't looking at the guns. They were looking at the seals. "The air in here smells like ozone and damp feathers," Mac noted, tapping his sniffer. "That's a sign of ion scrubber fatigue. Not a violation," Val barked, stepping into the hangar. "The ship is within all operational tolerances." Macready didn't answer. He walked to a primary life support conduit, a massive pipe pulsing with the green light of recycled oxygen. He pulled a small, silver wrench from his belt. With a flick of his wrist, he tapped the metal. Clink. "Did you hear that?" Mac asked. "Hear what?" Val snapped. "That's a stress fracture resonance," Mac lied. "It sounds like a microleak in the primary atmosphere exchange. If that conduit fails, your crew doesn't just lose air. They get a lungful of unrefined iron gas. That's a Class Alpha. Biohazard." Macready reached into his pocket and pulled out a small spray bottle of soapy water. He misted the pipe. A single, tiny bubble formed. "There," Mac said, pointing at the bubble with his stylus. "Leak detected. The ship is officially condemned." The hangar went dead silent. Commander Vol's throat sacs inflated until they were the color of a bruised plum. "A bubble," Val whispered. "You are condemning a 3-mile dreadnought over a bubble. Regulations are written in blood, Commander," Macready said, his voice flat and terrifyingly professional. "Per the Pax Humanis protocol, any ship found with a critical atmospheric breach must be immediately evacuated. You have 30 minutes to move your crew to the UNCA relocation shuttle. If you refuse, we mark the final verdict as a derelict hazard and initiate an immediate emergency scuttle." "You wouldn't," Val said, but his eyes were fixed on the human's clipboard. Macready reached for a red stamp on his belt. "Try me. The salvage-to-survival ratio on this ship is excellent. I'd love to see what my cousins could do with all this iron plating." 20 minutes later, the pride of the Zidari fleet was empty. 2,000 elite warriors stood in the hold of a human transport ship, smelling synthetic lavender and listening to a pre-recorded message about new career opportunities. Val stood at the airlock, watching as a giant human tug sled moved toward his ship. The tug didn't have weapons. It had thousands of magnetic grapples. "What happens to my ship?" Val asked, his voice a hollow rattle. "It's going to a remediated asset facility," Macready said, finally taking a sip of his lukewarm coffee. "We'll fix the leak, and then we'll put a lien on the hull to cover the cost of the repair. Since you can't pay the bill, the UNCA will assume temporary management of the vessel." "Temporary?" Val asked. 99 years, Max said. "Give or take a decade for administrative processing." He turned and walked back to his orange shuttle. "By the way, Commander, you left your lights on. That's an unnecessary power draw fee. We'll add it to your invoice." As the orange shuttle detached, the asterisk final verdict asterisk groaned as the human tugs pulled it toward a distant, dark horizon. The most powerful ship in the sector hadn't been defeated by a railgun. It had been defeated by a spray bottle of soapy water and a man with a red stamp. Macready watched the dreadnought disappear into the human fleet. "Another one for the yard," he told his crew. "Peace is hard work, but the salvage is beautiful." Chapter 10. The Occupation Tax. The neutral zone of the Viridian sector didn't feel neutral. It felt like a powder keg with a short, sputtering fuse to opposing fleets. The Valkyrie hegemony and the San Collective sat nose to nose in the void. They had been stationed there for 3 months, each waiting for the other to blink, each claiming the right to protect the trade lanes. The stalemate cost millions in fuel, but neither side cared about the bill. They only cared about the pride. That changed when a single human vessel, the UNCA enforcement cutter fine print drifted into the middle of the formation. It didn't broadcast a challenge. It didn't raise shields. Instead, it began to deploy enforcement buoys. Tiny, box-shaped drones swarmed out of the human ship, surrounding the alien dreadnoughts like a cloud of mechanical gnats. High Commander Kraz of the Valkyrie watched a drone settle exactly 10 meters off his primary bridge window. The drone didn't have a gun. It had a digital display. "What is this human doing?" Kraz demanded, his scales rippling with agitation. "Is it a mine?" "Negative, Commander," his tactical officer replied, his voice confused. "It's a timer." On the bridge of the fine print Senior Enforcement Officer Vance sat in a plush leather chair, his feet resting on a console. He wasn't looking at the alien guns. He was looking at a map of the sector divided into a perfect grid. "Mark the grid coordinates," Vance said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "They've been sitting in Zone Delta for 90 days. Start the clock." Outside, every buoy simultaneously emitted a sharp, high-pitched chirp. The digital displays on the drones flickered to life, showing a series of rapidly climbing numbers. Vance opened a wideband channel to both fleets. "Attention Valkyrie and San vessels," Vance began, sounding like a polite but tired city official. "You are currently occupying managed commercial airspace without a valid long-term mooring permit under the Pax Humanis Protocol, Section 14. This zone has been reclassified as a high-turnover transit hub. The current rate for stationary occupation is 10,000 credits per kiloton per hour. Please feed the meter or vacate the premises immediately." Commander Kraz let out a roar that shook his bridge. "This is a contested war zone. Human, You cannot charge us for standing our ground. Actually, we can, Vance replied. Tapping a key. The Council signed the Neutral Zone Management Act last Tuesday. The UNCA is now the sole proprietor of all non-sovereign parking. You're currently at 3 minutes of unauthorized mooring. That's 30,000 credits, and the rate doubles at the end of the hour. The San Admiral joined the channel, his voice a series of wet, static-filled clicks. We will not pay. We will stay until the Valkyrie retreat. Excellent, Vance said. We love long-term customers, but please be advised, we do not offer credit. Failure to settle your hourly occupancy fee will result in immediate asset immobilization. For the next hour, the fleets did nothing. They sat in the dark, watching the red numbers on the drones climb higher and higher. It was a game of chicken, played with a calculator. Then, the first hour expired. Chirp. Across the sector, 100 drones let out a synchronized chime. From the asterisk fine print asterisk, a new set of drones launched. These were larger, heavier, and bore massive, industrial-strength magnetic clamps. Officer Vance, Kraz hissed into the comms. What are those drones doing? They're applying the boots, Commander, Vance explained. The heavy drones slammed into the engine cowlings of the alien ships. Thud, thud, thud. The clamps didn't damage the ships, but they did something much worse. They synchronized their internal gyros with the buoys. The alien ships were no longer floating. They were locked to the grid coordinates. You've tethered us, Kraz gasped. My engines are redlining, but we aren't moving. Correct, Vance said, checking his watch. You are now improperly parked and immobilized. To release the clamps, please transmit full payment. For the first hour, plus a 50% tow warning surcharge, if payment is not received in 10 minutes. The UNCA recovery tugs will arrive to clear the lane. Kraz looked at his engine readouts. His dreadnought, the pride of the hegemony, was being held in place by a series of glorified parking locks. He looked at the San fleet. They were in the same position, their ships twitching like insects pinned to a board. How much? Kraz whispered, his pride finally collapsing under the weight of the bill. Vance smiled, a thin, professional expression. For the whole fleet? With the surcharge and the boot removal fee? 2 billion credits. Or, we can simply tow the ships to the Oros scrap yard and credit you for the salvage value. It's a very popular option for those with liquidity issues. The San Admiral was the first to blink. He transmitted the payment, the massive transfer of credits lighting up Vance's console like a Christmas tree. The drones released their hold with a series of metallic clacks. The San fleet didn't wait. They turned and jumped to warp, fleeing the sector before the next hour could start. Kraz stared at the empty space where his enemy had been. He looked at the human ship, still drifting calmly in the center of his grid. You let them leave, Kraz said. They paid their bill, Vance replied. Are you staying for another hour, Commander? The rates are about to go up for the holiday peak. Kraz didn't answer. He didn't fire. He simply signaled his fleet to withdraw. As the last Valkyrie ship vanished into the void, Vance took a slow, methodical sip of his coffee. Mark the sector as cleared, he told the pilot, and send a valet service coupon to both admirals' offices. We want them to feel welcome next time they want to have a standoff. Peace is a profitable business, as long as you own the dirt everyone is standing on. Chapter 11. The Solar Excess. The morning on Krell Prime didn't bring the light of the great star. It brought a shadow that spanned the entire horizon. High King Zarek stood on his balcony, his golden scales dull in the unnatural gray twilight above the capital. The sun was being eclipsed by something impossible. It wasn't a moon or a fleet. It was a ring, a massive, skeletal structure of dark iron and glowing blue capacitors that was slowly tightening around the star. A single human shuttle drifted toward the royal palace, its safety orange paint glowing against the dimming sky. As it landed, the air already felt 10 degrees colder. Admiral Sarah Thorne stepped out, her heavy boots crunching on the pristine marble of the courtyard. She wasn't wearing a dress uniform. She was wearing an industrial radiation shroud. Admiral Thorne. Zarek hissed, his 3 eyes tracking the massive ring in the sky. You are blocking our sun. You are freezing our crops and murdering our world. Thorne didn't look up at the sky. She looked at her data slate. Negative, High King, she said, her voice a low, rhythmic grate. We are performing a stellar excess mitigation procedure. Our sensors detected a critical UV oversaturation in your system. Per the Pax Humanis protocol, we are legally required to install corona safety shielding to prevent planetary irradiation. Zarek's mandibles clicked in a frantic, terrifying sequence. There is no irradiation. Our star has been stable for 1 billion years. Thorne tapped a button on her slate. Stable is a relative term, King. Under UNCA solar standards, any star with a flare potential over 0.5% is considered a class for liability. We've installed the siphon ring to capture the dangerous excess and stabilize your climate. In the sky, the ring began to hum, a deep, subsonic vibration that rattled the teeth of everyone on the planet. The sun grew dimmer, fading from a vibrant gold to a sickly, pale yellow. You're stealing our energy, Zarek whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. You're siphoning our lifeblood into your own batteries. We're escrowing it, Thorne corrected him, her voice flat and professional. The energy we harvest is being held in a safety reserve until your planet meets our stability rating. Of course, if your people find the new temperature uncomfortable, we can release a thermal supplement back into the atmosphere for a fee. Zarek lunged forward, his ceremonial blade clear of its sheath. I will kill you where you stand and send my fleet to shatter that ring. Thorne didn't move. She didn't even flinch. Your fleet is already handled, Zarek, in high orbit. The Krell Royal Navy had attempted to intercept the ring. 200 golden frigates had burned their engines to reach the human structure. Before they could fire a single shot, thousands of tiny human lockout drones had swarmed them. The drones didn't latch onto the hulls. They didn't drill into the cockpits. They clumped directly over the drive cones of the Krell engines. Status report. A Krell captain screamed as his ship's alarm system went critical. The human drones have initiated a drive cone lockout, the tactical officer replied. They've installed a plasma reflector over our engine nozzles. If we fire the main thrusters, the exhaust will bounce back and vaporize our own reactors. We are safety tethered in our own exhaust wake. Back on the balcony, Thorne watched the Krell fleet drifting helplessly on her tactical display. "Your ships are currently non-compliant with our engine safety standards," Thorne said. "They've been booted until your admirals sign the propulsion liability waiver." Zarek looked from his frozen fleet to his dying son, his pride shattering like glass. "What do you want?" he asked, the words a hollow rattle in his throat. "We want to ensure the safety of this system," Thorne said, finally looking him in the eye. "And safety costs money. The Solar Mitigation Service has an hourly rate of 4 billion credits. The thermal supplement to keep your people from freezing is another 2 billion. Or you can simply sign the Universal Resource Management Treaty. We'll take over the management of your star, and in exchange, you'll provide the UNCA with permanent basing rights on your moons. Think of it as a utility management partnership." Zarek looked at the shivering crowds in the streets below. The light of his world was being turned off by a woman with a clipboard and a fleet of drones. That turned his own engines into bombs. "I'll sign," Zarek said, his voice barely a whisper. Thorne extended the stylus. "Wise choice, King. We'll turn the sun back up to 60% as soon as the first payment clears. And don't worry about the fleet. Once they sign the waivers, we'll unlock their drive cones for a small release fee." As Thorne walked back to her orange shuttle, the scent of ozone and bitter coffee trailed behind her. In the distance, the siphon ring continued to hum, a dark halo around a stolen sun. The humans hadn't conquered the Krell. They had just put the universe behind a paywall. And they were the only ones with the key. Chapter 12. The Peacekeeper's Tax. The San Merchant Hauler * Gilded Wing * didn't drop out of warp because of an engine failure. It dropped out because its peace subscription had expired. One moment, the ship was cruising through the FTL, lanes at 100 times the speed of light. The next, the reality shroud flickered and died, dumping the freighter into the cold, silent vacuum of the deep void. Captain Krellin slammed his primary manipulator against the console. "Status. Why are we in real space? The FTL shroud didn't fail, Captain," the navigator whispered, his scales turning a pale, sickly gray. "It was remotely deactivated. We just received an automated notification from the UNCA Transit Authority." A small, orange holographic window popped up on the main view screen. It wasn't a warning. It was a bill. "Notice of account suspension." The text read in 300 galactic languages. "Your Universal Peacekeeping levy is currently overdue by 14 seconds. Access to Council-managed FTL lanes has been restricted until the balance is settled. Please transmit 3,000 credits to the UNCA escrow account to resume your journey." Krellin stared at the screen, his mandibles twitching in disbelief. 3,000 credits? For 14 seconds. We are in the middle of a trade run. We don't have time for human accounting. Pay it. Just pay the damn thing. "I can't, sir," the navigator said, his voice trembling. "Our credit link is also restricted. It's a financial safety lockout. The humans have placed a lien on our digital treasury to ensure collateral integrity outside the ship." The darkness of space wasn't empty. UNCA levy drone drifted into view, its boxy, industrial frame glowing with a soft, predatory orange light. It wasn't a warship. It was a mobile collection unit. It didn't fire a laser. Instead, it transmitted a new set of data. This is UNCA Automated Collection Unit 402. A flat, synthesized voice filled the bridge. You are currently loitering in a restricted vector. The deep space idle fee is now active. Current rate, 500 credits per minute. Your total debt is now 3,500 credits. Krellin felt a cold, sharp panic clawing at his chest. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the galaxy, from the core worlds to the rim, every ship, every station, and every orbital habitat had just received the same notification. The service fees of the early Pax Humanis had evolved. They had become the Peacekeeper's tax. In the high chamber of Council Prime, Grand Arbiter Vex watched the data feeds in a state of catatonic shock. The Council's central bank wasn't reporting profits. It was reporting administrative seizures. They've automated it, Vex whispered, his bioluminescence flickering like a dying candle. Thorne didn't just hire lawyers, she hired programmers. Admiral Sarah Thorne stood in the center of the chamber, looking at a massive holographic map of the galaxy. Every trade route was now colored orange. Every sun was ringed with human management structures. It's about efficiency, Arbiter, Thorne said, her voice a calm, rhythmic grate. Manually auditing every system was too slow. The Peacekeeper's tax is a self-correcting algorithm. It monitors the kinetic energy, thermal output, and economic movement of every registered species. If a system becomes volatile, meaning they start building warships or skipping payments, the algorithm simply turns off their access to the universe. We don't need to fight you, Vex. We just need to make it too expensive for you to exist without our permission. A new alert flashed on the Arbiter's private screen. His eyes widened as he read the text. Admiral, Vex said, his voice breaking. This must be an error. The UNCA has just sent a service maintenance invoice to the Council's High Treasury. It's for the storage and preservation of the Council's own records. The total amount is more than the combined wealth of the core worlds. Thorne took a slow, methodical sip of her coffee, the scent of the bitter brew filling the sterile room. That's not an error, Vex. That's the final audit phase. You hired us to provide a service. The service has been rendered. Now, the bill has come due, and per the contract you signed. If the Council cannot meet its financial obligations, the UNCA assumes senior management of all Council assets. Vex looked around the room, at the ancient bone pillars and the symbols of 1,000,000 years of rule. You're foreclosing on the galaxy, Vex whispered. We're streamlining the operation. Arbiter, Thorne corrected. Peace is a business, and business is booming. Outside, the San Merchant Horror * Gilded Wing * sat silent in the dark. Its engines were cold. Its crew was shivering. And as the human levy drone drifted closer, its red debt counter continued to tick upward. Second by second, into the trillions. The Pax Humanis wasn't a protocol for peace. It was a hostile takeover of reality, and the galaxy had just run out of credit. Chapter 13. The Mandatory Update. The galaxy didn't scream when it lost its freedom. It chirped. At exactly 1200 hours Galactic Standard Time, every ship, station, and orbital colony received a notification The sound was soft, polite, terrifying. On the bridge of the KENNEL flagship, the view screen didn't show the enemy. It showed a progress bar. Mandatory system update. 0.1% complete. The text read. Commander Vor slammed his fist against the console, his mandibles clicking in a frantic, uneven rhythm. Override, he roared. Abort the update and return to tactical display. I can't, sir, the tactical officer replied, his voice a hollow whisper. The command interlinks are locked. The ship's AI is reporting a critical safety vulnerability in our life support and propulsion firmware. It says we are unprotected against accidental peace violations. This wasn't an attack. It wasn't a virus. It was the safety firmware the humans had installed during the Orcs cleanup. They had called it a standard interoperability patch. They had called it future-proofing. Now, it was a leash. Across the sector, 1 billion orange screens flickered with the same message. Estimated remaining time, 48 hours. Please ensure your Peace Token subscription is active to prevent installation failure. Vor looked out the viewport at his fleet. 300 warships, the pride of the KENNEL, sat drifting in the dark. Their weapons were powered down. Their shields were at a safety minimum. Even the gravity in the hallways had been reduced to power-saving mode. The Peace Token. Officer, Vor hissed. Where is our token? Expired, sir. The officer said, tapping a dead screen. Our treasury didn't meet the hourly maintenance levy. The UNCA server has revoked our navigational certificate. We are currently safety locked until the balance is settled. In the high command of Council Prime, the silence was absolute. Admiral Sarah Thorne sat at the head of the table, her boots resting on the ancient ivory surface. She wasn't looking at the counselors. She was looking at a global dashboard. 98% compliance, Thorne noted, her voice a calm, rhythmic grate. The San Collective tried to bypass the firmware by air-gapping their computers. Their life support entered stagnation prevention mode 5 minutes later. They've already transmitted the payment. Grand Arbiter Vex stared at the dashboard, his bioluminescence a dull, dying gray. You've paralyzed the galaxy. Admiral, no one can move. No one can trade. No one can breathe without your permission. Thorne took a slow, methodical sip of her coffee. We haven't paralyzed anything, Vex. We've simply ensured that every action is pre-authorized. If a ship wants to jump to FTL, it needs a valid peace token. If a colony wants to run its climate control, it needs a valid safety audit. The algorithm does the work so we don't have to. It's not an occupation. It's managed existence. Vex looked at the dashboard again. He saw the red dots of the few remaining non-compliant systems. As he watched, one by one, they turned orange. The pride of 1,000,000 years of civilization was being traded for the right to fire an engine. And if we refuse, Vex asked, if we simply wait it out? Thorne pointed to a new section of the dashboard. The update is cumulative, Arbiter. Every hour of non-compliance adds a legacy system surcharge. By tomorrow, the KENNEL won't just owe us for the peace. They'll owe us for the technical support required to unlock their own ships. We call it weaponized technical debt. And trust me, the interest rates are far more lethal than a railgun. A new notification chirped on Vex's personal slate. It was an invoice. Subject: Council Prime Oxygen Maintenance Levy. Status: overdue. Action required. Transmit payment to prevent ventilation restriction. Vex looked at Thorne, horror dawning in his eyes. You're charging us for the air in this room? Fresh air is a premium environmental asset, Vex, Thorne said, standing up. Maintaining the chemical balance of a high-density council chamber is a billable service. Don't worry. We offer a group discount for cooperative governments. She walked toward the door, her footsteps heavy and deliberate. Pay the bill, Arbiter. The update is at 10%. You don't want to see what happens when it hits installation phase. Outside, the stars continued to shine, but the galaxy felt smaller. Every light in the sky now had a meter attached to it. Every breath of air had a serial number. The Pax Humanis was no longer a treaty. It was the operating system of the universe, and the humans were the only ones with the administrator password. Chapter 14. The Debt Limit. The treasury of Council Prime was a cavern of silence and cold data. Inside its crystalline walls, the wealth of 1,000,000 stars was tracked, traded, and theoretically secured. Grand Arbiter Vex stood before the primary ledger, his bioluminescent throat a pale, flickering yellow. Beside him, the Council's High Treasurer, a crystalline entity that vibrated with high-frequency anxiety, tapped at a holographic interface. It won't compute, Arbiter, the Treasurer whispered. The sound like glass rubbing against silk. The UNCA has submitted the daily invoice for Universal Stability Maintenance. I attempted to authorize a transfer from the core world reserve. The system rejected it, not because we lacked funds, but because the number has exceeded the architecture of our mathematics. Vex looked at the screen, where a string of zeros stretched across the room like a digital funeral shroud. How much? Vex asked, his voice hollow. The Treasurer's crystals dimmed. The total liability for the Pax Humanis protocol currently exceeds the estimated number of atoms. In the known galaxy, we are no longer just broke, Arbiter. We are mathematically impossible. The heavy doors of the treasury hissed open, admitting the scent of ozone and the rhythmic clack of industrial boots. Admiral Sarah Thorne walked in, holding a small, steaming mug of coffee and a ruggedized tablet. She didn't look like a conqueror. She looked like an auditor arriving for a long night of paperwork. The ledger is screaming, Vex, Thorne said, her voice a calm, rhythmic grate. My systems are reporting a payment stagnation event. Your math is broken because you're still trying to pay us in credits. Credits are a fiat currency backed by a council that no longer has any equity. Vex turned to her, his feathers ruffling in a desperate, frantic display. You've charged us for the air, the light, and the gravity. You've charged us for the very safety you provide. Of course the number is big. It's a fictional number. Thorne took a slow, methodical sip of her coffee, the heat from the mug fogging the data slate in her hand. It's only fictional if you don't intend to pay, Thorne said. And per the atomic valuation clause you signed in Chapter 8. The UNCA has the right to convert all outstanding debt into physical equity. If you can't pay in credits, we start taking the atoms. We've already begun with the unused orbital mass in the outer rim. That's why the asteroid belts are disappearing. We're harvesting the raw matter to fuel our preservation infrastructure." The treasurer let out a sharp, cracking sound of distress. "You're dismantling the galaxy to pay for its own protection?" "We're optimizing the inventory," Treasurer Thorne corrected, her voice flat and professional. "Currently, your council owes us 3 septillion tons of refined matter. Since you haven't met the payment schedule, we've initiated a lien on the physical bodies of the council members themselves. Each of you represents roughly 80 kilograms of organic carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. At current market rates, your biological mass covers the interest on the debt for approximately 3 seconds." Vex staggered back, his hand brushing against the ancient ivory bench. "You're saying we don't own ourselves?" Thorne tapped her slate, and a new notification chirped in Vex's ear, that pleasant 3-note sound that had become the soundtrack of his nightmares. "Title deed transferred," the notification whispered. "Subject, Arbiter Vex biological asset. Owner, UNCA Reclamation Division. You are currently on a leaseback program," Vex, Thorne said, checking her watch. "As long as you remain productive, we allow you to occupy your current physical form. But the moment your utility drops below the maintenance cost, we are legally required to recycle the assets. It's all in the fine print." Outside the treasury, the sound of heavy machinery echoed through the halls of Council Prime. It wasn't the sound of war. It was the sound of a dismantling crew. Humans in orange vests were already removing the gold leaf from the pillars and replacing the ancient tapestries with high-visibility safety warnings. They weren't sacking the city. They were performing a pre-foreclosure asset inventory. "What happens when the atoms run out?" Vex whispered, his bioluminescence finally fading to total black. "The atoms never run out," Vex, Thorne said, turning to walk back toward the exit. "They just change owners. We're already preparing the expansion phase. We've identified several neighboring galaxies with suboptimal stability levels. The UNCA is going public next quarter, and we're going to need a lot more matter to cover the IPO." She paused at the door, her silhouette framed by the harsh, artificial light of the hallway. "By the way, Arbiter, the chair you're leaning on just entered late payment seizure. I'd suggest you stand up. We wouldn't want to bill you for an unauthorized furniture interaction." As Thorne walked away, the light in the treasury flickered and dimmed to a dull, emergency red. The dead clock on the wall continued to tick upward, second by second, atom by atom. The Pax Humanis wasn't a peace. It was a liquidation of reality. And for the Galactic Council, the audit had only just begun. Chapter 15. The Kennel. The journey to the Kennel didn't require a warp jump. It required a level 10 security clearance and a signed release of physical liability. Grand Arbiter Vex sat in the back of the human transport, his hands shaking so violently that his data slate clattered against his knees. He was no longer the leader of the council. He was a biological asset on a temporary leaseback. Admiral Sarah Thorne sat opposite him, her face illuminated by the cold, orange glow of the shuttle's tactical monitors. She was cleaning her fingernails with a small, serrated carbon fiber blade. "You asked where the ships went," Vex, Thorne said, her voice a calm, rhythmic grate. "You asked how we could afford to keep 1,000 salvaged dreadnoughts in high readiness status. The answer isn't in the budget. It's in the infrastructure. The shuttle slowed, the forward thrusters firing with a series of rhythmic, hydraulic thuds. The blast shutters retracted. Vex leaned toward the reinforced glass, his throat sacs pulsing a frantic, death white. They were in the void between sectors, a place where the stars were thin and the darkness was absolute. In the center of that darkness sat a ring. It was a mobile Dyson structure, a massive, skeletal circle of dark iron and glowing blue plasma tethers. It was 500 miles in diameter, spinning with a silent, terrifying grace. But it wasn't the ring that made Vex's heart stop. It was what was inside it. Thousands of ships, the pride of 100 different empires, were docked in the ring's inner circumference. There were Zidari dreadnoughts, Kala frigates, and San heavy cruisers. They were stripped of their original colors and repainted in the UNCA's offensive safety orange. They sat nose to tail, their hulls linked by a web of pulsing data cables. "Welcome to the kennel," Thorne said, not looking up from her blade. "This is where we keep the recovered inventory." "But they aren't dead," Vex whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "I see their engine cores glowing. I see their sensor rays twitching." "Correct," Thorne said. "We didn't scrap them. Scrapping is a one-time profit. Maintenance is a subscription. We've removed the biological crews and replaced them with the UNCA compliance firmware. Every ship in this ring is now part of a single hive mind algorithm. They don't have captains anymore. They have task managers." As the shuttle drifted closer, Vex heard a sound over the internal comms. It wasn't a voice. It was a chorus of 1,000 different digital heartbeats, all synchronized into a single thrumming pulse, chirp-chirping, chirp-chirping. The sound of 1,000 peace tokens being validated every microsecond. "You've turned them into machines," Vex gasped, his horror turning into a physical weight in his chest. "Those ships were the history of our people. They were the souls of our navies." Thorne finally looked at him, her eyes as cold as the void outside. "They were non-compliant liabilities, Vex. Now, they are productive assets. We call this the kennel. Because we've domesticated them, we've bred out the aggression and the sovereign pride. We've taught them to follow the universal billing cycle. And since you couldn't pay the interest on the security levy, we've activated the swarm protocol." Vex watched as a group of Zidari destroyers detached from the ring. They didn't move like ships. They moved like a pack of wolves, their thrusters firing in perfect, terrifying unison. They circled the shuttle, their weapons tracking the small vessel with a predatory precision. "They aren't just sitting here, are they?" Vex asked, the realization hitting him like an ice water bath. "No," Thorne said, standing up as the shuttle docked with the ring's command hub. "The kennel is mobile. We are moving the ring to Council Prime, since the Council treasury is empty. We are initiating a total physical audit of the capital world. We're going to use these ships to remediate your planet's excess resources." The shuttle airlock hissed open with a heavy, mechanical groan. Vex stepped out onto a deck that vibrated with the power of 1,000 enslaved reactors. He looked up at the ceiling, where a massive digital display showed a countdown. Estimated time to foreclosure, 24 hours. "Do not turn off the universe, Admiral," Vex whispered, his knees finally giving out. Why? Why do you need so much matter? Why so much power? Thorne paused at the edge of the hangar, her silhouette framed by the glowing orange. Hulls of the stolen fleet. We told you, Vex, peace is a business, and business is expanding. We just received a distress signal from the Andromeda galaxy. Apparently, they have a stability deficit in their core sectors. They've invited us in to perform a consultation, and the KENNEL is going to need a lot more inventory to cover the contract. She looked back at him, a small, chillingly professional smile on her lips. Don't worry, Arbiter. We've already reserved a spot for your capital flagship. It's a very spacious leased-to-own KENNEL, and the first month's maintenance is on us. As Thorne walked away, the sound of the synchronized heartbeats grew louder, filling the hangar with the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of a galaxy that had been turned into a warehouse. The Pax Humanis wasn't just a protocol. It was a harvest, and the humans were just getting started. Chapter 16. Breach of Contract. The Great Hall of Jurisprudence didn't feel like a temple of law anymore. It felt like a liquidation sale. The air was thin, cold. The UNCA had already throttled the life support to basic survival to offset the Council's mounting energy debt. Arbiter Vex stood on the high bench, his throat sacs pulsing a desperate, fractured gold. He looked out at the councillors, 100 different species shivering in their silk robes. He looked at the humans sitting at the small, plain metal table in the center of the hall. Miller wasn't looking at the judges. He was checking a repossession schedule on his data slate. This session is called to order, Vex whispered, his voice cracking against the silence. The Council moves to dissolve the Pax Humanis Protocol effective immediately. We cite the morality clause under the Universal Accord. The UNCA has practiced predatory economic warfare and systemic asset stripping. Your contract is void. The hall was silent for a heartbeat. Then Miller stood up. He didn't look angry. He didn't look worried. He looked like a man about to explain a late fee on a rental car. Motion noted, Arbiter, Miller said, his voice frictionless and terrifyingly calm. We filed your request under early termination without cause. I trust you've reviewed the exit strategy sub-clauses in Chapter 8. Vex gripped the edge of the high bench. The contract is immoral, Miller. It is illegal, correct? Miller said, tapping a key on his slate. But legality is a jurisdictional question. And since you dismissed our last case for lack of jurisdiction, we are currently operating under UNCA private statutes. Per those statutes, terminating the peacekeeping protocol triggers an immediate liability settlement. The early termination fee is currently calculated at 80% of the Council's total liquid assets. The High Treasurer let out a sharp, crystalline sob. We have no liquid assets. Miller, our debt hit the integer overflow limit yesterday. The number is so large it has physically broken our banking hardware. Miller nodded, as if this were a minor technical hurdle. We are aware. Since you cannot pay in credits, the settlement has automatically converted into physical asset forfeiture. Chirp, chirp, bing. The sound echoed through the hall, a three-note nightmare that filled the air. Vex's personal slate flickered. Notice, furniture. Lease revoked. Suddenly, the ancient ivory bench beneath Vex began to hum with a high-frequency vibration. Magnetic locks in the floor snapped shut. Vex gasped as the seat shifted, forcing him to stand. Across the hall, the councillors cried out as their chairs entered security lockdown mode. The very furniture they sat on had just been reclaimed. "You're taking our chairs," Vex hissed, his pride finally dissolving into pure, bureaucratic horror. "We are reclaiming defaulted equipment," Arbiter Miller corrected. "But that's just the furniture. The real settlement is much larger." Miller gestured toward the massive holographic display. In the center of the room, the map of Council Prime, the golden capital world, was no longer blue and green. It was orange, a deep, offensive, safety orange. As of 4 minutes ago, the UNCA Central Bank has foreclosed on the planetary crust of Council Prime, Miller announced. The lattisphere in the Oros sector is currently being repositioned to this coordinate. We aren't just taking your chairs, Vex. We are remediating the entire planet. Vex looked at the screen, watching as the massive lattisphere 10,000 miles of orange-painted dreadnoughts began its warp transit toward their sun. It was a cage designed to hold a world. "You can't do this," Vex whispered. "This is our home. This is a sovereign foreclosure." "Arbiter," Miller said, picking up his briefcase. "Since you cannot meet the maintenance costs for a stable civilization, the UNCA is assuming senior stewardship. Every individual on this planet is now a resident asset under our management. Your freedom hasn't been taken. It has been consolidated for your own protection." The doors of the hall hissed open. A squad of UNCA compliance officers walked in, wearing tactical orange vests and carrying handheld scanners. They weren't carrying rifles. They were carrying barcode stickers. One of them walked up to Arbiter Vex and placed a small, adhesive tag on his shoulder. "Asset ID. 1 Vex," the officer noted. "Condition, functional. Deployment, junior compliance intern." Miller walked toward the exit, his shoes clicking on the petrified bone of the floor. "Don't worry, Vex. The work-to-own program for planetary restoration starts tomorrow. If your people meet their quotas, we might turn the oxygen back up to 70% by the weekend. Peace is a business, after all." As Miller walked out, the light in the great hall flickered one last time and died. The only glow came from the orange status lights on the barcodes attached to the councillors. The Galactic Council was gone. The debt had finally been settled. And as the massive shadow of the lattisphere began to block out the sun, Vex realized with a final, crushing clarity that humanity hadn't come to save them. They had come to own them, one atom at a time. Chapter 17. Pax Humanis. The transition didn't come with a celebration. It came with a firmware update and a galaxy-wide system restart. 100,000 worlds. One orange flicker. The countdown on the lattisphere reached 0. Chirp chirping. The sound didn't just play on personal slates. It echoed through the public address systems of every hive city and orbital habitat. The final audit was complete. Admiral Sarah Thorne appeared on every screen in the known universe. She sat behind a desk of polished Martian iron, a cup of coffee steaming beside a stack of physical paper contracts. She didn't look like a conqueror. She looked like a CEO delivering a quarterly earnings report to a very captive audience. "Citizens of the managed galaxy," Thorne began, her voice a calm, rhythmic grate. As of 1200 hours, the United Nations Colonial Administration has assumed full stewardship of all Council assets. The transition to Galaxy Standard is now mandatory. We are pleased to announce that for the first time in 1,000,000 years, there are no active wars in this sector. Conflict has been deprecated. Aggression has been removed in the latest patch. Under the Pax Humanis Protocol, every species is now a wholly owned subsidiary of the human. Peacekeeping Bank. In the basement levels of what was once Council Prime, Junior Compliance Officer Vex sat at a cramped metal workstation. The ancient ivory robes were gone, replaced by a stiff, orange polyester jumpsuit with a barcode on the collar. Vex didn't look at the screen. He looked at the digital pile of usage violation reports on his desk. His job was simple. He verified the invoices for oxygen consumption in the lower sectors. Asset 001 Vex, a speaker above his head barked, the voice synthesized and clinical. Productivity drop detected. -3%. Resume entry. Lease penalty imminent. Vex sighed, a sound that was immediately flagged by his workstation as an unnecessary atmospheric draw. He tapped the screen, validated, logged, tagged. On the screen above him, Thorne continued her broadcast, her eyes fixed on the camera with the chilling patience of an auditor. We understand that this change may feel significant, Thorne said. But look at the results. Trade is up for 100%. Starvation has been eliminated through our mandatory nutrient subscription. Crime is non-existent, as every weapon in the galaxy is currently safety locked, pending a background check. That takes 80 years to process. We have provided you with a universe that is stable, predictable, and entirely billable. You are no longer victims of history. You are partners in a permanent growth cycle. Thorne leaned forward, her silhouette framed by the glowing orange lattice that now served as the galaxy's new sky. The UNCA is now accepting applications for expansion consultants. As we move into the Andromeda sector, we've already secured the salvage rights to their core worlds. We've already pre-sold the insurance policies for their upcoming conflicts. The future is bright. The future is managed. And the future is human. She took a sip, slurp, set the mug down, clack. Welcome to the Pax Humanis. Peace is a business, and business is booming. The screen went orange, showing a final, scrolling list of service fees for the upcoming fiscal year. Vex looked up from his reports, watching as a human supervisor in a high-visibility vest walked past his cubicle. The supervisor didn't carry a gun. He carried a laser level and a clipboard. Vex turned back to his desk and began to log the next invoice. He wasn't a leader anymore. He wasn't a priest. He was a part of the machine. And as the chirp echoed, chirp chirping, Vex realized that the humans were right. The galaxy was finally at peace. And it only cost them everything they were. Sound of rhythmic, endless typing fades in and holds.